Started. So today I will be discussing building design systems with accessibility in mind. And so in this webinar, I will talk about at a very high level what a design system is, give you some tips on building one. And again, this is very high level. This thing can be massive. And talk about how can we incorporate accessibility within that process. A little bit about me. So I actually started off in software development. I went to a coding boot camp here in Chicago called Actualized. And from there, I really developed an interest in the front end of things. I gravitated towards UX, UI, and kind of just dove headfirst into that. I was working at ThoughtWorks and I made a career change over to experienced designer. I did a little bit of shadowing and working on some projects, really enjoyed the work. And so that began my career. About 3 years in, I decided to join Great Shore Associates, which is where I am today. And then in the midst of that, I started Black Design Solutions. And my goal is to promote design systems, design process within teams, as well as accessible products. All right, so I'm going to talk about what is a design system? The most important thing to remember is that a design system is managed and implemented by people. It really is a system in that there are various moving parts. It consists of components, patterns, styles, and guidelines that help operationalize and optimize your efforts. And so there are a lot of different groups that can be involved. But I'm going to speak from the perspective of designers, product owners, and developers, which I will collectively refer to as the product team. But again, various functions are included, including like marketing team, for example. And all of these groups work together to ensure the integrity of the system. All right, so what tools can we use to start off with this design system thing, right? So first, if you have designers or if you're a designer yourself, you'll probably be very familiar with design tools such as Sketch or Figma. And so these are the tools where you actually go in and think about like, okay, well, what do these components look like? As well as start to map out some of the interactions. So you kind of start to think about like the look and feel of things that will go into your system. Then these are kind of optional, but I actually really like them. There are handover tools such as Zeppelin or Envision app. And what these do is it kind of streamlines the process of getting a design from designers to, I want to say developers, but it streamlines the process of getting it from designers to a lot of different parties. So what you can do, so let's say if you work in agile environment and you have stories, you can drop a link to a specific component to that story, or you can also send a link to a stakeholder. And from there, you kind of begin this collaborative process of being able to, have conversations about the thing that you have designed. And these tools also have prototyping capabilities as well. So you can kind of, manipulate your designs to show them what a typical flow may look like. And these, more so than I've seen in Sketch or Figma, they're a little bit more advanced in terms of the code snippets that they provide. And so that's kind of like the benefit of having like a handover tool. And then something else you might want to use, or actually this is very important, is a front-end component library. And what comes to mind when I say that is like a storybook. And so this is where your developers would actually work to code out the component and again, be able to collaborate with various parties. And so this is a little bit better than the handover tools because this is the actual real thing. And so you're able to work with, as a developer, you're able to work with designers and other stakeholders to show them kind of like what the behavior of the component is, what it looks like. And it's just kind of like rounding off the whole process. And it's great for marketing. So, you can just for the whole preview aspect of it. So now I'm going to really dive into the how. Again, this is super high level. I'm going to give you resources if you want to dive a little bit deeper. But, step one is designing the components in the style guide. And so, you want to work with the designer, and the designer will work with marketing team and product to come up with the look and feel. Is your brand conservative? Is it a little looser and fun? You'll start to decide on things like that. And one thing I want to call out is that the image that you are seeing to the right is borrowed from Ant Design System. And so what that is, it's a style kit. And so style kits are what people will use. It's kind of like an out of the box example of various components. And they're super useful in that, it's like a quick way to get started and to, start to think about like various things that you can do in terms of style. There are drawbacks to this, which I will circle back to shortly. And then in other cases, you may be using a design agency to create your designs. And so you will receive them from there. So step two in creating the design system is to think about the interaction. So this deals with determining the states for various components. So how do you want, how should they look when users interact with them? So in this example for Ant D, right, you see various buttons. So you see a default standard state, like what the button looks like, just if it's on a page. And then we see a hover state, right? So if the user takes their mouse and hover over it, what does that look like? As well as focus. So if you're tabbing through with a keyboard, we want to make sure that we have a state for that as well. And we want to give the user a visual indication if they cannot interact with that thing. And so that's where the disabled state comes from. So these are sort of the types of things that you want to think about within your when you're designing. Basically, is to just kind of like highlight those things so that it makes it easier for, number one, the developer to know how things should look as they're coding it. But the most important thing is giving the user some sort of visual indicator. And I will talk about that a little bit more when we dive into the accessibility portion. So step three is more on the developer side, and that is developing and storing components. So this is where, you have talked to the developer as a designer, or, you're a developer yourself. And so you are building out these components that you've chosen, thinking about how they look, thinking about the interactions, and you are housing those things within a library. And again, this is a very collaborative process. So you may want to build it and bring in product. You may want to get some feedback from marketing, and just kind of, teamwork makes the dream work. And, kind of finalize what those components look and feel like. Now I'm going to tie all of this together. So just as a recap, number one, you're going to design components in a style guide, and the tools that you can use would be like Figma, Sketch, or, I've seen Adobe XD as a popular one. Determining interactions you can use those same design tools. They have the capability as well as using like Zeppelin or InvisionUp, as I mentioned earlier. And then you want to develop and store, and storing, you could use something like Storybook. And so I would recommend, if you really want to go deep into this, I recommend that you research Brad Frost, who developed Atomic Design. That is a very well-known and widely used design system, and he pretty much talks about everything. So even if you are within an organization or on a team and you want some place to start in terms of like starting the conversations about implementing a design system, or you want to know a little bit more about what it means to maintain one, then I would highly recommend some of his content. So the benefits of a design system. The first one I would say is consistency across products. Because this is collaborative, and ideally it's something that you are maintaining across an enterprise or across multiple teams, there will be a shared understanding in how components are used. And in that way, you can say, for example, like, we have this button and we know that we use this button for this specific thing. And collectively, you all know how to use this button. And it just kind of helps, right? Because it kind of takes the guesswork out of like what you should use, because you have this nice shiny thing into the component library and you know when to use it. And in that way, it also enables quicker product development because it takes off some of that guesswork and some of the it enables teams to make their own decisions, because you don't really have to like lean on your designer so much. You know what components could be used for what type of feature. And so in that case, you kind of enable your team to make those decisions on their own, which is really awesome. And it's completely iterative, right? So let's say you don't have the right component, or maybe you need something to function a little bit differently than you once did, then you can iterate on that thing, and you can go back to the process of, even if you want to start as early as the design phase and rethink it from there. And then again, just go through your steps and just ensure that everyone has a collective understanding of like this new thing, how we're building it, how we use it. And you just can keep doing this over and over as much as you need to. Another thing that someone recently, Louise on my team, brought to my attention was something that Tatiana Mack said. So Tatiana Mack is really influential in the accessibility community. She promotes inclusivity, accessibility, and ethical products. So design systems help highlight biases. So they help to kind of break down the barrier to decentralize who is creating things. And it helps to highlight like how and why have we made it in such a way. So let's say we are doing usability testing where we are getting some other sort of feedback, and we realize that we've somehow managed to disregard the needs of a certain group. Then we can talk about why we did that and begin these conversations to think about like, okay, well, how can we do better going forward? How can we be a little bit more inclusive? how can we be a little bit more inclusive in the future to make sure that we don't run into this thing again? And so in that way, it just starts the pattern of thinking about ways to continuously think about like, how can you make better products? And along the lines of being more inclusive, that kind of brings me to accessibility. So what is accessibility? So accessibility focuses on how a person with a disability accesses or benefits from a site, system, or application. And so one thing we want to think about is that, you know, people may not be able to use their eyes, ears, or hands in the way that we do, right? And even us, like sometimes like we may need special accommodations now or later or whenever. And then just thinking about the fact that many people do use assistive technologies to complete various tasks. So why should we care? And that's because accessibility addresses discriminatory aspects related to equivalent user experiences for people with disabilities. So, you know, going back to one of the benefits of having a design system, you know, it kind of like brings to light some of the decisions we're making, and you know, accessibility helps us to thinking about things in an accessible way helps us to correct that. Most people will need accommodations at some point in their life. That's something I just brought up. So you could you could have a baby and need to use the keyboard. I mean, like right now I have my dog here because he has a bit of anxiety. And if he's not sitting in my lap, sometimes he kind of goes crazy and starts barking. So, you know, in that case, you may need to use the keyboard. And so you need to always be thinking about like, not in a othering way, but like just empathy for all cases, for all people, and understanding that at some case in some circumstances, you know, you just need to have an accessible product for everyone to have access to it. And then another thing is that there are web standards through WCAG, and your app may be subject to accessibility audits. And again, this is all a good thing because it enforces that we care about and think about accessibility. So WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and it's part of a series of web accessibility guidelines published by the Web Accessibility Initiative, also called WAI, of the World Wide Web Consortium, which is also called W3. And this is an international standards organization for the internet. So, for example, on my last project, we went through an accessibility audit, and you know, they just made sure that we were indeed following some of these guidelines. And it's just, if you are going to have there's certain requirements for certain types of businesses who have a web presence, and so you may be subject to this audit. And in that case, you want to make sure that you are designing for it up front, because sometimes having to circle back to correct these things, you know, then you're up against time and effort and things of that nature. So it's better if you just go into it in the very beginning, thinking about these things. Accessibility is kind of under the umbrella of usability, right? So in order to make something usable, it should be accessible. And that's why the way I like us to think about it is good usability is just good accessibility. So, think of your product, you want it to be very user friendly, you want this to be something that people have access to, and that's just a way to think about it. Like, is my product really usable if I don't have the best accessibility? All right, so W3C, which I just mentioned, has some basic considerations to help you get started with making your user interface design and visual design more accessible for people with disabilities. I am going to, so there's a lot here on this slide, but I'm going to separate it out. So how do you make designs, more accessible through visual affordances? So we're going to take these top two. So the first one that is called out as a guideline is to provide sufficient contrast between foreground and background. There are several plugins available through both Figma and Sketch that I know of that aid in visual contrast. If you look there to your right, the image is from, it's actually a plugin called Contrast. And so what that does is you can select a component that you've designed in Figma and run it through Contrast, the plugin, and it will let you know if you meet those contrast ratio standards. And if you don't, then you know that you can go back and correct it. And there are also a plethora of web tools that will tell you whether or not you can plug in a hex code, and it'll let you know if it passes contrast ratio or not. But but you can use a tool like this, and you can identify within your designs what has sufficient contrast. So now these buttons that I'm using are from Andes, the design system that I showed you the buttons of earlier. And as we can see, they actually don't pass the contrast ratio. So one thing that I want to remind us all is that even as designers, we do like to borrow or at least draw inspiration from other design kits and things that other designers have done. But we should also think about the fact that designers have different goals in mind. And so if we are going in with the goal of making the most accessible product possible, then we should also make sure that if we are indeed using an out-of-the-box kit or something from another source, that we are doing our due diligence to also use tools such as this one to ensure that these components are meeting our expectations. So even as non-designers, if you have borrowed a component, you can use there are various like browser plugins that you can use, as well as websites like what I just mentioned, where you can go in and plug in the color codes and make sure that they are indeed sufficient. There's also high contrast mode, which is super cool because you can go in and actually visually see what things look like when put up against high contrast. So you can see how your designs perform or your website performs for itself, and you would be able to make the needed changes. All right, so then the next guideline is don't use color alone to convey information. The reason being is that, of course, people may have some sort of visual impairment, they may have color blindness. And so if you are using things like, let's say, green or, for a successful state, or like red for failing, there are people who may struggle with seeing those differences. And so in that case, you would want to pair that component or that particular aspect of the design with something like an icon or symbols or text, images, or something that just gives an additional visual cue to your users. And the GIF that you see moving here is another type of plugin. It's called Stark. I think it's very popular. I love it. And what this does is gives you the ability to do visual simulations so that when you design, and I'm taking those A&D buttons and I'm looking at how they look with various sorts of vision types. All right, the next thing I'm going to talk about is improving accessibility by mapping out interactions. So this next slide here, I know it's going to be hard to make out, but this is just an example of a table that I did with my team. And what I just want to show you is just like how much can go into annotating your designs for accessibility and just kind of like what that could potentially look like and all the things that you should be accounting for. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what is included in this screenshot. So we have tab and focus order. So this outlines the visual flow of the page when a user is using a keyboard. And so when they are tabbing through, you actually want to, as a designer, as a developer, as a product owner, you want to dictate exactly what that visual flow looks like throughout the application. You just want to make sure that it makes sense. Sometimes tab order can be used to create a certain experience. So for example, if you want to bring the user to a specific point, like if you're developing for e-commerce, for example, maybe you just want them to tab from the banner directly down to the products, so and that way it can be used to kind of create an experience in itself. As well as, again, improve accessibility. Images, we call out images because, again, sometimes, number one, people may heavily rely on those images, but then also if, for example, they cannot see the images, then we want to add something like alt text for identification purposes, which a screen reader will pick up and read out to the user to let them know exactly what it is that they have tabbed through. Then we have landmarks. So landmarks or regions, they're also called, identifies the area on a page to help with navigation for users that use screen readers. So what that may look like is something like, we highlight the banner and then we highlight the main content. And so that just helps to orient users who are using things like screen readers for assistive technologies. And then we have focus states. So focus states are very important. I touched on them a little bit earlier. So not only does it inform the developers of what should happen when users interact with components, but users know what happens and they receive these visual cues that they are at the correct place and exactly where they want to be. So if they are hovering, for example, you're using your mouse, it's very nice to be able to receive some sort of visual affordance that you are indeed hovered over the button or the row or whatever it is that you are aiming for. And that goes across the area for different states. And focus state is also something that accessibility audits pay attention to a lot. Again, just because it's one of those like really quick wins that's super easy and just improves the user experience so much. And then I want to show you a close example of what a screen reader annotation looks like. So let's say, as a designer or developer, we want to piece apart various components and annotate them to communicate a little bit better, like what our expectations are from an accessibility standpoint. So what you see under number 1 for screen reader is at the very top left, we see filters, and that's the name that we've decided to give it. So the filters component is actually a button. And then for state, we're setting the ARIA label. So ARIA labels provide semantics so that authors can convey user interface behaviors and structural information to assistive technologies. So this is, again, what the screen reader will pick up and what it will say. And as designers or developers, what we want to do is so you see SR, and that's screen reader, and that's just highlighting what we hope to hear from the screen reader perspective. And maybe it does not have to be exact, but like we want to make sure that it makes sense, basically. So then going back to the example earlier that I showed you of the table that we've been working on, you see that we've highlighted, I've highlighted the region and then tab order, which are the little blue squares with the arrows that we've used to indicate when they're tabbing exactly what points should they hit. And then we have the screen reader notes, and it's probably impossible to read, but that's just what we talked about on the previous slide. Those are some of the things that we're calling out in terms of, what type of component is, like the role that it plays, the ARIA labels, what we expect the screen reader to say, etc. All right, so then I want to talk about adding accessibility to your component library by just keeping general usability tips and patterns in mind. All right, so drawing from those guidelines, you want to ensure that form elements include clearly associated labels. So you want to make sure that you can actually see the label. I provided an example here, and what can happen sometimes is if we're using an input field, or this is just the way some input fields are designed, whereas you see the placeholder text within the field, but what happens when the user writes their email address here or types their email address here, for example, you lose context as to what that field was for. And so this can be a little bit confusing if you have like a long field, for example, and so then a user starts to second guess what they've put in, and it can just cause a lot of pain points. And so you want to do something like making sure that it is always visible, so the user always has context as to what that field is for. And then you want to make sure that the labels are always in close proximity to what it is related to. And so that's just the way our brain works. Like when we see things that are close together, then we like to group it. And so you want to use headings and spacings to group related content. Then you want to create designs for different viewport sizes. So I know for me, I like to, when I'm designing, I like to take like the largest Mac screen size. It's just easier for us sometimes, but you also want to think about the fact that the user may not be using a screen that size. And so if you can start off with a large design, but then also just make sure you are also accounting for, okay, well, we have this table. Well, what does it look like on a smaller screen? We have less real estate. We don't want to make it to where we lose context because now we've condensed the columns and we're losing some of the content. And so if that does happen, what happens? Do we truncate it? Do we add a scroll bar? You know, how do we make sure that this table is still usable and still accessible through various screen sizes? And with that, you want to consider responsiveness, right? So if the user is manipulating their window or just kind of calling out like, well, what happens on smaller screen sizes? And then just setting that as a general pattern, and that will be something that the development team will consider, and we can start to code those things out, right? And then you want to consider font sizing. So, you know, a lot of us may struggle with our vision, and so there are actually standards through WCAG. There's certain standards as far as how small things can be, even when we think about things like touch targets. So touch targets are like what's the maximum width and height of the area where which if I hover over that thing, I can still have access to it. And so it's all about like, you know, again, just making sure that you are making things to where your user doesn't have to struggle to see it, to use it, to be able to hover over it and access it. So lastly, I just want to leave us with a message about empathy, which should be embedded each time we approach the development or design of a new application, because through empathy, we are able to put ourselves in other people's shoes and connect with how they may be feeling about their problem, circumstance, or a situation, and we can use that to create better products for everyone. So we can make things user friendly. We can ensure that everyone has access to it, and that's kind of the goal. All right, so yeah, feel free to keep in touch. So I can be found at Dana Black on LinkedIn. I also have Twitter, D Black Designs, as well as Black Design Solutions. And then you can just email me, danasblack@gmail.com.
That was amazing. Thank you. We have a question in the Q&A. I was going to read it off for you
Sure.
from Amy, who says, as a dev, I'm very familiar with ARIA, but I wouldn't expect designers to know that. What's a good resource for designers to help them learn about name, role, state, and ARIA use?
Oh gosh, you know, I have, so actually DQ. I would definitely recommend DQ. That is a design network, as well as they are very adamant on educating people about accessibility. And so that's where I've drawn a lot of my knowledge from. They have like a ton of webinars, a ton of online resources that you can use. And so, yeah, I would definitely, if you have a design team, signing up for one of those webinars would be awesome for them.
And a question from Louise. Can you speak a little more about the importance for designers and devs to collaborate and not to work in silos?
Sure can. So Louise and I, we actually work very closely. And so the reason being is that it's just important. I kind of touched on it a little bit, but just making sure that so number one, like as designers, like we kind of approach things from like a usability perspective, and we have certain ideas and understand like certain guidelines as in terms of like what are best practices. And so working with a developer, you kind of bridge the gap in order to communicate those things, and just it just helps with the education portion of it. Like I would say working with developers as well as product owners to kind of enable everyone to be able to make the best decisions possible when you know, creating components. So that's kind of like one of the, I mean, there are 1,000 reasons, but yeah, it's great. And then just to ensure like the integrity of the design, right? And so just to make sure like we can use a handover tool to pass something off, for example, but it's just like, you know, the communication and just talking a little bit in depth about how things behave. Like it just makes the process go a lot smoother.
Yeah, and that pairing creates a lot of empathy because as an engineer, I have not in the past had a lot of appreciation for these things, but pairing with a designer builds my empathy and then it builds the designer's empathy. So I think it's great. I've got another one here. Any advice or resources for doing a full accessibility audit of our product suite? Ooh.
Oh, yeah. So I would say visit the WCAG website because they provide a lot of guidelines there for various roles, including designers, including developers, front-end developers. And it's kind of like a straight from the source thing where you'll be able to see, yep. Thank you for providing that link, Amy. Yeah, so you'll be able to like access something like that and you'll see exactly what it is that people who are coming in to do the audits are looking for. And so you can kind of pre-plan for that scenario.
And then I've got one just because I come at all of this from an engineering perspective. And then I'm also really a fan of unit tests and things that tell me early in the cycle of when I might be in trouble. So because so much of design, if you're working in Figma and then you're kind of translating that to an engineer, are there things that designers use as like their equivalent of unit tests, or how do you think about quality when you design, and how do you early notification of when you might be hitting issues in design?
Yeah, so that would go back to like using tools like Stark or Contrast if you want to test like various components for how they work up against some of the guidelines. But then, yeah, Paula, that's actually something I want to learn a little bit more about. I've talked about, which is the fact that there are certain, I know that there are front end usability automated tests that you can use that also help to highlight certain things in terms of like if because as a designer, right, like I don't really get to a sense of the real look and feel until I see that the developer has done it. So
Yeah.
so that's where communication comes in as well, and just like looking at things like storybook so that we can pair. So yeah, so just, sometimes there can be a little bit of a gap, but I think that just making sure that you are annotating well enough and communicating well enough, like that can kind of help to close that in.
Oh, and I've got another question here from Akello, and I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Hello, I am inquiring what should be put into consideration when determining the colors for a design?
Ooh. So I would just say from a accessibility standpoint, number one is a lot of people so there are some color blindness that are more prevalent than others, and that's like I believe like red, green. And so you might want to just think about like how you're utilizing those specific colors. But in terms of colors, I would just say you can pretty much there are a lot that you can use. It's just a matter of ensuring that your contrast ratios work. So I would say like, and that's something I have found myself often having to push back against, even when it comes to like marketing teams, for example. Like sometimes they'll give you this really pretty, nice looking example of a website and beautiful color palettes, and maybe sometimes even prototypes, but I would run it through something like a contrast tool and I would see that like, it's beautiful. But in terms of accessibility, like this is actually something that we cannot use. And in that case, what you can do is utilize one of those web tools where you can plug in the hex codes and you can kind of get something close. So even if you can't use exactly what they wanted, you can get pretty close. And then just having communications about why this thing may not work and like what can we use as an alternative. Uh-oh, Paula.
Yep. There we go. I'm back. So one from Stephanie, or Webbs as I know her. What ways of working and rituals have you found help facilitate cross-functional pairing, like design and development and other cross-functional pairing?
Uh, hmm. You just really have to be intentional about it. Like I've done it a few different ways. And again, like it can vary across different teams, but I, I found it useful that like before, like I found it useful to engage with a developer like very early on in the process to kind of talk about what it is that you are looking for. And then once the development starts, to just keep the relationship close, keep the communication close, so that it's not to where like things have already been built and it's already a little bit too far. And then, you're kind of circling back to ensure that things are working up to your expectations. So it's just kind of like, it's just a matter of like being intentional and like finding out what works for your team and just embedding that as a process, but making sure you make it a part of the process. Sorry, Paula, I can't hear you.
Anyone else? I was just seeing if anyone else has some questions for Dana, or I know for me, I think this was a great session, and it makes me interested in going on and digging into some of these references and topics. I'll give it a 1, 2, 3. I don't see anything else coming right into the Q&A. So with that, I will give everyone 10 minutes back of their day. I know there was also a question that was answered about the recording, that Women Who Code will be making the recording available for those who joined late or for those who couldn't attend. And we've got a lot of thank yous pouring in to the chat. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day, morning, noon, evening, and please keep joining us at these great Women Who Code cloud events. And thank you, Dana.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dana. Thank you so much for doing this session. And it was great having you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It was awesome.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Do take care. Bye-bye.